April 17, 1943, North Atlantic, 140 miles west of the Hebrides. Kapitänleutnant Ernst Vogel stood in the conning tower of U-512, scanning the gray horizon through salt-streaked binoculars. The air was cold. The sea was rough. And somewhere above the cloud cover, he could hear it, the distant, rhythmic drone of aircraft engines. Alarm! Fliegzeug! The lookouts dropped through the hatch. Vogel followed. The klaxon shrieked through the hull as boots hammered against steel decking. The hatch clanged shut. Sealed. The boat tipped forward, nose down, beginning its plunge into the dark. Flood tanks. Take her to 80 meters. The boat groaned as water filled the ballast chambers. The needle on the depth gauge began to climb. 20 meters, 40, 60. The hull creaked under the mounting pressure, a sound every submariner knew, a sound that was normal, expected, part of the rhythm of life beneath the waves. But then, at 73 meters, there was another sound, not a creak, not a groan, a crack, sharp, metallic, wrong. Vogel's eyes snapped to the pressure hull overhead. The crew froze. Someone whispered a prayer. The chief engineer turned pale, his hand hovering over the valve controls, uncertain whether to stop the dive or push deeper to escape the aircraft above. "Sir." The crack came again, louder this time, and then a third, like the snapping of a frozen branch under weight. Vogel opened his mouth to give the order, "Surface, blow tanks, get up, get out," but the words never left his throat. The hull didn't explode inward. It folded. A section of plating near the forward battery compartment buckled silently, almost gently, as if the steel itself had decided it no longer wished to hold its shape. Water didn't burst through in a violent jet. It seeped, then poured, then roared as the ocean claimed the space where air had been. U-512 never surfaced. No distress signal was sent. No wreck was recovered. In the logbooks of the Kriegsmarine, it was listed simply as missing, cause unknown. By the spring of 1943, this was becoming a pattern. In the cold offices of Allied naval intelligence in London, analysts were noticing something strange. U-boats were disappearing. Not in the expected way, not under the thunder of depth charges or the strafing fire of Allied aircraft. They were vanishing in areas where no combat had been reported, no destroyer groups nearby, no bombers confirmed overhead, just gone. At first, it was assumed to be operational error. Submarines were fragile machines operating in a hostile environment. Metal fatigue, human mistake, a faulty valve, a miscalculated dive. The sea was unforgiving, and even experienced crews could make lethal errors. But the numbers didn't support that explanation. Between March and June of 1943, 17 U-boats disappeared without a trace. No final radio transmissions. No debris fields. No survivors. The losses were scattered across the North Atlantic, the Bay of Biscay, the Arctic convoy routes. Geographically random. Operationally inexplicable. German Naval Command was equally baffled. Großadmiral Karl Dronitz, architect of the Wolfpack strategy, demanded answers. His staff reviewed maintenance logs, crew records, operational orders. They found nothing. The boats had been seaworthy. The crews experienced. The missions routine. And yet they had simply ceased to exist. What the Germans didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that the Allies had introduced a new kind of weapon into the war beneath the waves. It wasn't loud. It wasn't fast. It didn't need to be. To understand what was happening, you have to understand what a submarine actually is. A U-boat was not a ship that could dive. It was a pressure vessel shaped like a ship. Every rivet, every weld, every seam was a potential point of failure. The deeper it went, the more the ocean wanted to crush it. At 50 meters, the pressure was roughly 5 atmospheres, 73 pounds per square inch, pressing against every surface. At 100 meters, it doubled. At 200, it quadrupled. The men inside lived within a steel tube held together by engineering tolerances measured in millimeters. They trusted that tube with their lives every time they submerged. They trusted the rivets, the welds, the steel itself. That trust was absolute. And it was precisely that trust the Allies decided to destroy. The device itself was almost absurdly simple. No larger than a thermos flask. Cylindrical. Weighted. Sealed in a waterproof casing that looked, from a distance, like a piece of ship debris or discarded equipment. Unremarkable. Forgettable. Inside was a small capsule containing a chemical compound. Later declassified documents would reveal it as a hydrogen embrittlement agent, a substance that, when introduced to certain types of steel under pressure, caused microscopic fractures in the metal's crystalline structure. Not immediately, not violently, slowly, quietly. Like rust, but faster. Like fatigue, but targeted. The capsule was attached to a pressure-sensitive timer. The device would activate only after reaching a specific depth, typically between 70 and 90 meters, the operational diving range of German U-boats. Once activated, the compound would seep through microscopic pores in the casing and adhere to the hull plating. The U-boat crew would notice nothing. No impact. No explosion. No alarm. But within hours, the steel around the device would begin to weaken. Molecular bonds breaking down under the combined stress of pressure, salt water, and chemical infiltration. By the time the submarine dove again, perhaps the next day, perhaps that same evening, the weakened section of hull would no longer be able to withstand the force of the deep. The ocean would do the rest. The genius of the weapon wasn't in its complexity, it was in its invisibility. A depth charge, when it detonated, created a shockwave that rattled the entire boat. Crew members knew they were under attack. They could respond, take evasive action, surface, fight back. There was agency in that. A sense of control, however fragile. This was different. There was no warning, no enemy to fight, no moment of decision. One dive, the hull held. The next, it didn't. And the men inside had no way of knowing which dive would be their last. Psychologically, it was devastating. U-boat crews began reporting strange sounds during dives, cracking noises that hadn't been there before, groans in the hull that seemed louder, more ominous. Engineers inspected the boats obsessively, finding nothing wrong, but unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. Captains became hesitant. Some refused to dive beyond 60 meters, even when pursuit demanded it. Others began surfacing at night more frequently, preferring the risk of aerial attack to the creeping dread of the deep. Morale reports from captured submariners revealed a consistent theme: fear not of the enemy, but of their own vessel. One prisoner, a machinist from U-243, described it as living inside a coffin that might decide, at any moment, to close. The weapon didn't just sink U-boats, it broke the men who sailed in them. The deployment of the devices was a masterpiece of covert operations. Allied naval intelligence had spent months mapping U-boat patrol routes, refueling points, and known transit corridors. They identified choke points, areas where submarines were forced to dive due to aerial patrols or convoy traffic. These became the target zones. Small, fast vessels, often disguised as fishing trawlers or neutral merchant ships, would enter these areas under cover of darkness. They carried crates marked as engine parts or damaged equipment. Inside were the devices, dozens of them, magnetically weighted to sink slowly and attached to any metallic surface they encountered. Some were dropped directly into known U-boat transit lanes. Others were placed near the entrances to submarine pens in occupied France and Norway, camouflaged among genuine wreckage and debris. A few were even delivered via airdrop, scattered across the Bay of Biscay in watertight containers designed to break open upon impact with the sea. The operation was compartmentalized. The men deploying the devices didn't know what they were. They were told they were experimental sonar buoys or hydrophones. Even most Allied naval officers were kept in the dark. The fewer people who knew, the smaller the chance of a leak. German counterintelligence suspected something was happening. Interrogations of captured Allied sailors produced vague references to special equipment and new anti-submarine measures, but nothing concrete. Dronitz ordered increased inspections of U-boats returning from patrol, but the devices, if they were even found, looked like harmless debris, easily overlooked or discarded. By the time German engineers began to suspect sabotage, dozens of U-boats had already been lost, and by then, it was too late. The collapse of confidence spread faster than the devices themselves. In May 1943, U-Boat Command issued a classified memorandum to all Atlantic flotillas. Crews were to report any unusual sounds, any unexplained structural anomalies, any deviation from expected hull behavior. The responses flooded in. Nearly every boat reported something. Strange vibrations, odd pressure readings, sounds that didn't feel right. Most of it was likely psychological hypervigilance born from fear. But some of it wasn't. U-331, operating off the coast of Algeria, surfaced after a shallow dive and discovered a section of outer hull plating had partially detached. No impact, no depth charge, just failure. U-18, in the mid-Atlantic, began taking on water during a routine dive to 70 meters. The leak was traced to a weld that had fractured along its entire length, as if the metal had turned brittle overnight. U-566 suffered a catastrophic hull breach at 85 meters. 14 men managed to escape using emergency breathing apparatus. When they were picked up by an Allied destroyer, they couldn't explain what had happened. One survivor insisted the boat had cracked like ice. The Wolfpack strategy, which had brought Britain to the edge of starvation in 1942, began to unravel. Coordination required submarines to operate in groups, diving and surfacing in coordinated patterns to hunt convoys. But captains were now reluctant to dive aggressively. Some broke formation to stay shallow. Others abandoned patrol zones entirely, returning to base with excuses of mechanical trouble. Dronitz, watching his tonnage numbers plummet, ordered courts-martial for cowardice, but you can't court-martial fear. And the fear was spreading faster than discipline could contain it. By June, the U-boat arm of the Kriegsmarine was no longer an offensive weapon. It was a force in retreat, haunted by an enemy it couldn't see, couldn't fight, and couldn't understand. The device was never meant to win the war alone. Its purpose was narrower, more surgical. It was designed to create doubt, to make the U-boat, which had been Germany's most reliable weapon in the Atlantic, feel unreliable. To turn the hunter into the hunted, not by destroyers or aircraft, but by the environment itself. And in that it succeeded beyond expectation. By mid-1943, Allied convoys were crossing the Atlantic with losses at their lowest point since 1940. The U-boat threat hadn't been eliminated. Submarines were still dangerous, still lethal, but the momentum had shifted. The psychological edge had turned. German submariners, once confident and aggressive, were now cautious and defensive. The devices themselves were phased out by late 1943. They were no longer needed. The damage had been done, not to the steel of the U-boats, but to the morale of the men who crewed them. The weapon had been so effective that its continued use became redundant. After the war, captured German naval officers were questioned about the mysterious losses of 1943. Most had no explanation. Some speculated about sabotage. A few mentioned rumors of a British hull poison, but these were dismissed as wartime paranoia. It wasn't until declassified documents emerged in the 1970s that the full scope of the operation became known. Even then, the technical details remained sparse. The chemical composition of the compound, the exact number of devices deployed, the full list of U-boats lost to the weapon. Some secrets, it seemed, were too valuable to fully reveal. April 17, 1943. Kapitänleutnant Ernst Vogel never knew what killed him. As U-512 tilted forward into its final dive, as the hull cracked and the water rushed in, he had no time to understand. No moment of clarity. Just the cold, the dark, and the sudden, crushing realization that the boat, his home, his fortress beneath the waves, had betrayed him. Somewhere, days earlier, a small cylindrical device had drifted through the water and settled against the pressure hull, just forward of the battery compartment. Magnetic. Silent. Patient. It had waited, and when U-512 dove to 73 meters, the device had done exactly what it was designed to do. Not with fire, not with force, but with a whisper. A chemical whisper that turned steel brittle, that made the rivets weak, that convinced the ocean it could finally claim what had always been its domain. The most effective weapons in war are not always the ones that roar. Sometimes they are the ones that make no sound at all. The ones that don't destroy ships, but the trust men place in them. The ones that turn the deep from a refuge into a grave. And U-512, like so many others, learned that lesson in the silence of the abyss, where no one could hear the steel break, where no one could hear the men scream, where the only witness was the indifferent, patient ocean. It didn't need to hear, it had already won.